Whenever I'm driving through Canal Flats in the East Kootenay, I'm compelled to tell the canal story. It's one of my favorites. Kind of obsessed by this story. Sit back and listen up, kids, I say. I'm going to tell you the tale of Adolph Bailey Groman and his wild scheme to build a canal to join the Kootenay and the Columbia Rivers.
Do we have to?
They're immediately transfixed. Well, kids, Bailey Groman was a wealthy Austrian writer and adventurer who loved the New World, especially the American and Canadian West. He was so enthralled by the region's vast empty spaces that he emigrated to British Columbia in the 1880s and settled at the very headwaters of the Columbia River, in a place called McGillivray's Portage. Groman chose this magnificent place because he had a plan. A bold and slightly nuts plan to make himself even richer than he already was. You see, children, right here at what is now Canal Flats, the Kootenay and Columbia Rivers are less than 2 kilometers apart, one going south, the other going north. Groman figured if he could dig a canal 6,700 feet long and link the two rivers, he'd open up vast swaths of the Canadian-American West to marine traffic. Back then there were no cars, and the Kootenays didn't have many rail lines, so the river was the highway. Plus, Groman thought that draining water out of the Columbia River would create a lot of new farmland in the Kootenays. More dollars. And did the government buy into this harebrained scheme? Well, they sure did. They agreed to give Groman 48,000 acres of that land if he dug the canal. So, on a summer day in 1887, the digging began, mostly by Chinese workers. For 2 years, they dug a trench they couldn't even see out of, 9 feet deep and 2 kilometers long. But by this time, the government had soured on Groman's plan, and so had the railways, which were suddenly wielding a lot of power in the Canadian West. They forced Groman to put an expensive lock in his canal to control the water, which he did, begrudgingly, and made it clear they had grown more interested in iron railway tracks than boat travel. Defeated, Groman returned to Europe before the first boat passed through his infamous canal. But 2 boats did make the historic journey from the Kootenay River to the Columbia in 1894 and 1902. By then, Groman had long since walked away from all of his hard work.
Are we there yet?
Almost. Hang in there. It's an epic tale. Crushed, Groman went on to collect furniture and art, write books, and hunt. Sometimes with his buddy Teddy Roosevelt, who would later become President of the United States. He lived a life of leisure back in Europe, a long way from McGillivray's Portage, which was renamed Canal Flats after Groman's scheme. The canal itself fell into disrepair and mostly collapsed in on itself altogether. But you can still see traces of it around this area, a testament to an old Austrian with a dream to link 2 mighty rivers. Hi, I'm Mitchell Scott, Editor-in-Chief of Kootenay Mountain Culture Magazine, and this is The Headwaters, brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. In this, our final episode of Season 1, we're going to the place that gave this podcast its name, the Columbia River. It's the 4th largest river in North America, and what a journey it takes. The Columbia begins in Canal Flats before heading north, then west, then south again. It cuts through the entire east and west Kootenay, then crosses the border into the United States before emptying into the Pacific Ocean at Astoria in the state of Oregon. It's a 2,000-kilometer journey, and the river has a drainage basin roughly the size of France. C'est bon! We're going to begin our Columbia River podcast at the beginning, with the Indigenous peoples of the basin. To the Sinixt and Ktunaxa peoples, among many other indigenous groups, the river is vital, a living part of them. The river was integral to their way of life. It was a source of food and transportation, but perhaps most importantly, it represented a deep spiritual connection to the land. We begin with the importance of the river to the Sinixt, then hear from Bonnie Harvey of the Ktunaxa.
Hi, I'm Storied. I am Shelley Boyd, and the importance of the river is that it is the heart of Indigenous people of the Columbia. We are called the Lakes, the Arrow Lakes people. Sin Aichks actually translates to the place. Sin Aichks is a bull trout, and that on the end is people, right? So it actually is the place of the bull trout people. And we'll turn it around in English and say the people of the bull trout. But it was the most critical thing. It was like, again, I always go back to the geography of the area. We were water people, and so not only was the rivers the mode of transportation and getting every place for us, it was our source of food. It was our connection. I mean, we look at the things that have happened to the river that have taken people away from it. So you don't just get the absence of the people. You don't just get the absence of the canoe. You don't just get the absence of the food. You also get the absence of the connection that the river brings to people.
The Ktunaxa creation story is what we know. It is our truth. It is not folklore. It has been passed down through each song, each memory, each echo of our being as Ktunaxa, and the echo of the time when Aktukskamna, when the animals ruled the earth. Our way of being is echoed back to us through the water. The Columbia River and the Kootenay River are very vital to who we are as Ktunaxa. And those waterways are the lifeline and our connection to our ancestors. The Columbia and Kootenay are our connection to the time before before people were created. And these two systems are vital to our connection to the time of creation, before there were peoples, before there were treaties involved. And these waterways were the veins of our language, the veins of our culture, the veins to our traditions, veins that reminded us of our whole connection to all of Amakas Ktunaxa.
The story of the Columbia River and Indigenous people. Powerful stuff. Of course, today the Columbia would be unrecognizable to their ancestors. We've stopped the free flow of the river again and again with dams. It started in the U.S. The first wall of concrete was erected when the Rock Island Dam was built during the Depression near Wenatchee, Washington. The entire Columbia River Basin has about 400 dams, 14 on the main stem of the river alone. 3 of those are in Canada, 11 in the U.S. There are places where the river feels more like a series of locks than a free-flowing waterway. It got us to thinking, how do these dams work? Who determines how much of the river is backed up or when that water is released? We sent Bob Keating out on a tour of a dam to report back. Bob, where were you?
Well, I decided to tour the Hugh Keenley Side Dam and the Arrow Lakes Generating Station, which sits right next to it. Both are near Castlegar. Hugh Keenley Side is the last dam on the Columbia before it winds its way down into the U.S. We have 3 dams here on the Columbia, Mitch. Keenley Side is the smallest of them, but the generating station next to it still generates enough electricity to light up the entire basin and then some.
It's some serious power.
It is.
But let's back up a little bit. Let's start with some history.
Okay, history lesson I will give you. Cue up the propaganda film.
The Columbia River, one of the most erratic in the world, is being harnessed. 30 miles north of the American border, Canadian engineers are constructing the massive Arrow Dam.
I don't understand why they talk like that back then.
I know. It's like they're screaming at you, selling you some kind of product. He describes the Columbia as the most erratic in the world, like it's something that needs to be tamed.
Which does bring up the controversial nature of these dams.
Yes, it does. But we're not going to get into that in this episode because we could do an entire series on dams and their effects on people and wildlife. It is safe to say, though, the dams on the Columbia River, starting in the U.S. and then in Canada, blocked the passage of salmon and other fish. They destroyed a way of life for Indigenous people who depend on the river. Whole towns had to be moved, and thousands of kilometers of river valley were flooded because of the dams. This is fertile land as well, or was fertile land, before the flooding. The Arrow Valley was second only to Fraser and Okanagan in terms of food production in British Columbia. It's now flooded up.
But on the flip side, these dams prevented flooding and today generate billions of dollars in revenue.
Yeah, they do. Without the dams, there would have been massive destructive floods in the basin in years like 2013, about 10 years ago, where there was huge flooding all around us, but not here. The same could have happened as happened in the Fraser Valley this year as well. These dams prevented catastrophic flooding because we now have control over the spring freshet the way we never did before. They also make us rich in hydroelectric dollars the way Alberta is awash in oil money. Simple as that. Cue propaganda guy once again.
The Columbia River project is a fine example of cooperation between two countries which will make possible a better life for millions both sides of the border.
Okay, so we're not going to debate with propaganda guy.
Why would we?
But I do want to know, how does a dam work?
Well, for that, we're going to get a tour of the last generating station in the basin. Our guide is Dan Geisler, who works for Columbia Basin Trust, which owns the power generation part of the dam and generating station, along with Columbia Power Corporation. The Hugh Keenley Side Dam is owned and operated by BC Hydro, was built in the late 60s, but for 3 decades it was just used for flood control, to regulate the flow of the Columbia into the U.S. Then, in the late 1990s, locals convinced the province to build power generation right next to the dam, and that's where we start our tour, on the roof of the 14-story high Arrow Lakes Generating Station.
The Hugh Keenley Side facility did not have any generation before, and it was purely a flood control facility. A spillway with a navigation lock. And we came, Columbia Basin Trust and Columbia Power, and built an expansion hydro generating facility around the side of it.
So up there on the roof, we can see the Arrow Lakes Reservoir, which is over 200 kilometers long and stretches well back to Revelstoke. It was created by the dam, by the Hugh Keenley Side Dam. This reservoir fluctuates by 15 meters, believe it or not, depending on the season and how much runoff is in the entire system. It's emptied and filled a bit like a bathtub. And just over 20 years ago, a canal was built beside the dam to divert the water and to generate the electricity. That's where the Arrow Lakes Generating Station comes in.
Okay, so when you get down into the guts of the power station, how does it work? How does this power just magically happen from fast-flowing water?
Well, let's clang our way downstairs with Dan into a giant bay where we can see the very tops of the 2 generators that produce that electricity. Like you, I'm a journalist, Mitch, a word guy. And as you know, most journalists know a little about everything and a lot about nothing. So I asked Dan to explain it to me like he would a visiting grade 5 class.
Hydro generation of electricity. So what we're doing is taking the power of falling water and taking that power and we're changing it with a hydro generator to the power of electricity. Water turns a turbine, the turbine turns a giant electromagnet called a rotor, and that rotor spins inside a loop of copper called a stator, and that magnet passing by the loop of copper creates electricity along the copper wires.
How much electricity is generated here?
So we have 2 units that are identical, and when they are both running at full capacity, they produce 185 million watts. So that's 185 megawatts. That's the total capacity of this facility.
Put that in terms I understand. What would that light up?
Over 60,000 homes.
So to sum up, hydropower is created with the force of water spinning turbines like propellers on an airplane, with magnets spinning inside the generator coupled above them. That's how we produce electricity. That electricity is then passed through high-voltage lines to substations, then on to businesses and homes. That's as simple as I can put it.
So, as you said earlier, it sounds like the Arrow Lakes generating station churns out a lot of power.
Yeah, not really. I mean, it does, enough for the entire Kootenays, but BC Hydro's 2 dams upstream on the Columbia River, Revelstoke and Mica Dam, each generate, get this, 13 to 14 times the amount of power that Arrow Lakes does. The 3 dams in combination generate enough electricity that it's half of BC's power needs, and they make a small fortune off the power they sell. We are a real powerhouse here in the Kootenays.
I like it. Powerhouse.
Yes.
I've often wondered who determines how much of that power we generate or when we spill water out of the dams downstream.
Yeah, that is a complicated question. The flows of the Kootenay Side Dam are controlled, believe it or not, down in the Fraser Valley. There's Fortis crews that work at the dam and do the maintenance there, and Columbia Power and Columbia Basin Trust owns it, but BC Hydro coordinates the flows in the entire Columbia River region in the Fraser Valley from a control center down there in the Fraser Valley. I'll pass that back to Dan to explain. Who determines how much water is spilled and how much electricity is generated here?
The control of the Columbia River flow, the control of that is all with BC Hydro. They get requests from the United States for increases or decreases of flow to be passed to the United States. Kootenay Side is the last dam on the Columbia in Canada before it enters the United States. So we're like the faucet, you could say. BC Hydro can shut it off or turn it on. And they get requests for that increase or decrease from the United States as well. Departments inside BC Hydro look at how much water is coming into the system, and they want to manage the elevation of the reservoirs.
Okay. Dan brings up the Americans, and I've always heard they control our water levels on the Columbia system. Is that true?
Yeah, it is to a degree. This flurry of dam building all happened in the 60s after the signing of the Columbia River Treaty. That's a cross-border agreement to manage levels in the Columbia for both countries on both sides of the border. It's a very unique agreement. There's no other agreement like it anywhere in the world. Flood control and power generation are the 2 main objectives, but Washington State is also the breadbasket of the West, and a lot of their food is grown with water from the Columbia River. They have great sway and great say over our levels up here.
Sounds like we're getting into another podcast series, but I've also heard that the treaty is under negotiation currently, is it not?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. The cross-border treaty to manage the rivers being looked at by Canada and the U.S. again. That's a whole other podcast. You're right. Very complex negotiations that are going to go on for around a decade. This time, by the way, there is Indigenous involvement. There's far more local participation in those talks as well, but the talks will drag on for years. This is really, really big stuff. There just is no more important resource than our water. Ask anyone who relies on the Colorado River, which is running dry because it was badly managed.
So if FortisBC operates and maintains the generating station in coordination with the owners, Columbia Power and Columbia Basin Trust, and BC Hydro controls water levels after consulting the Americans, where do locals fit into this whole equation?
Well, it all is very confusing because there were so many entities involved. But Columbia Power Corporation and Columbia Basin Trust own the Arrow Lakes generating station on behalf of people of the Kootenays. And half the money generated from that power station and the 3 others on the Kootenay and Pend Oreille river systems is put back into the local economy. So we split revenues with the province. Last year, $76 million came back to us here in the basin. That's reinvested in things like wildlife studies, daycare centers, affordable housing.
It touches all aspects of our life here in the basin,
does.
in some form or fashion.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure how many people in the basin truly realize just how significant these dams are to shaping the place we live, but they do. Locals used to be able, by the way, just take the very tour I did, but COVID-19 ended that, like so many things. I'm not sure the tours are coming back either, which is a shame because these dams are fascinating and an integral part of where we live. They have changed this place.
Thanks, Bob. Kind of like going back to school, but really important stuff all basin residents should know and understand. we're going to wind up our podcast with a remarkable journey. Christopher Swain was the first, and as far as we know, the only person to swim the entire length of the Columbia River. A couple of decades ago, Swain, who's from New York City, donned one of those full-length bodysuits only serious swimmers wear, and he dove into Columbia Lake, right at Canal Flats, the headwaters of the Columbia River system.
The reason I swam the entire 2,000-kilometer length of the Columbia River was that I wanted to shine a light on the dislocated peoples and the disrupted ecosystems of the Columbia River Basin. I thought I need to have a direct personal experience. So I thought I'm going to put my body in that river. I'm going to swim the entire length. I'm going to learn everything I can, and I'm going to come out and testify about what I found and what my hopes were for this river, the great River of the West.
2 years later, Swain hauled himself out of the Columbia River. He now swims endangered and polluted rivers all over the continent to bring attention to their plight. He's a winner of the International Earth Day Award from the United Nations and has spoken to tens of thousands of kids about water protection. In short, he's made epic swims a career, and it all started with his first challenge, to swim the entire length of the Columbia River.
The biggest challenge of my swim wasn't what most people think. It wasn't the 2,000 kilometers I had to swim over 13 months, so that was 165 days in the water with time off to try to work odd jobs and stay connected to family. And it wasn't so much the freezing cold, because I got in water that was very near freezing in some parts of the winter. And it wasn't even the financial shredding that I was undergoing, the small amounts of money I could raise to keep going and the stresses that caused. I think really the most difficult part for me was the loneliness. There's no one else doing this kind of thing, and there were very few people to talk to who could really understand that struggle. So I think the conversations that I ended up having with First Nations and Native American peoples, that really kept me going. Their struggle, what they had gone through, what they had lost, the isolation that they were describing, feeling, emotional isolation, social isolation. I was feeling a lot of those other things from a different place and in a different way in the swim, and hearing some of those stories and some of that testimony helped me keep going to rise to the challenge of that loneliness and find reasons bigger than myself to go on.
And that's our podcast about the river that gave us our name. The Headwaters is produced by Kootenay Mountain Culture Magazine and brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. This podcast would not be possible without Bob Keating, our resident Power Ranger, who writes, produces, and edits each episode. Stacey Muchowski does our design. Jesse Lee writes and performs our music. Tara Cunningham and Vince Hemsall are our editors, and Peter Moynes is our co-producer. Thank you to the dozens of Basin residents we profiled in Season 1. If you want to find out more about them and listen to all 10 episodes of Season 1, head on over to headwaterspodcast.com. I'm Mitchell Scott. Thanks for listening. Columbia Basin Trust is creating a legacy of social, economic, and environmental well-being in the Columbia Basin. Learn more at ourtrust.org.